She's Director of Health Policy at the Independent Women's Forum. I began by asking about the key differences between Hillary Clinton's and Donald Trump's economic visions.
Well, to put it simply, I would say that Mrs. Clinton would suggest that the United States economy needs to be more fair, it needs to be fairer. And in order to get there, she's willing to make it slightly less free by putting more regulations on the energy sector, on agriculture, on our healthcare system. While on the other hand, Mr. Trump's view is that the economy needs to be more free, a freer economy, and that it's not so much the government's role to ensure that we have a fair economy. Or he might suggest that a freer economy is a fairer economy. So that's where I think that the division actually lies. It's a philosophical debate, very typical of the Republican versus Democrat debate that we have in the United States. A question of should we focus on growing the economy or should we focus on how the resources in the economy are divided?
Now, it's not just the candidates, but also their supporters that seem to have these very different stances with how life has really developed for them in the US. The Pew Research Center found that an overwhelming majority of Trump supporters, about 81%, feel life is worse now than it was 50 years ago, whereas the majority of Clinton supporters see life as better. Why do you think there are such markedly different perceptions?
Well, it often depends on which metrics we're using to measure the direction of the economy. So you can look at overall growth in terms of the GDP, you can look at wage growth among different subpopulations in the United States, and you can look at income inequality, any number of these metrics, and you can make a case for how the economy has been improving for some people in the United States, or it's been getting worse for other people in the United States. So I would suggest actually what we have is more of a bifurcated economy where, yes, we are seeing improvements in some sectors for some people, but then on the other hand, we're seeing some backsliding or stagnation in wages in different industries.
People kind of looking at different sides of the same coin, apparently. Now, one thing that we haven't really heard much about is entitlement spending from the presidential candidates, especially in the debates. And for those who aren't familiar, these are some of the government's social programs that meet certain criteria for workers that give them benefits like welfare, health, pensions, etc. So considering just how much of the federal budget actually goes into this sector, are you surprised that we haven't heard more about it?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very important issue, but it's a very politically dangerous territory for candidates on either side of the aisle. So about 25% of our federal budget is today spent on Social Security. Another 25% goes to health care benefits like Medicare, Medicaid, and now the Affordable Care Act. And then another 10% goes to social safety net programs like food stamps, housing assistance, and so forth. So this occupies something like 60% of all of the federal spending that we do, while defense spending, for example, takes only 16%. And people are often surprised to hear those figures. But the reality of the politics of this situation is that these are promises that the government has made, often going back as far as the 1960s when Social Security and Medicare were new programs. And each new wave of politicians wants to focus on keeping those promises to the American people as people start to plan their lives around expecting retirement savings from Social Security and expecting Medicare to be there for them in their older age and retirement years. So when Americans start to expect that those things will be there, it becomes very difficult for politicians to talk about changing those programs.
So when it comes to some of the things that come with these programs, obviously these are not cheap. As we mentioned, they take up a great amount of the budget. Now, former Fed Chief Alan Greenspan cautioned about the rising ratio of these entitlement programs to GDP and how it could affect things like productivity and eventually investment. And many analysts say that the current model is actually unsustainable. So then what does the next president need to do beyond the promises to end up making this a sustainable model?
Right. So last year in 2015, the federal government spent about $3.7 trillion total, and $3.2 trillion was paid for by tax revenue. That means about $500 billion in spending was deficit spending. One of the reasons it's so difficult for politicians to address issues like entitlements is that it's very easy actually to do debt and deficit spending. But it is true that when an economy takes on too much deficit spending, it does have an impact on our ability to grow as an economy. So we're carrying a lot of weight, and in fact, about 6% of our federal spending goes just to servicing the interest on our national debt. So there's no political lobby that's really focused on the future and focused on the harm to our economy that we do when we do deficit spending. So that's really, therein lies the rub, that there are political groups that are very focused on keeping the benefits that are in place today, whereas it's much harder for people to look on down the road when, for example, the Social Security Trust Fund or the Medicare Trust Fund will be bankrupt in years to come. It's harder to focus on the future than it is on the present.